Before we begin the session, I first like to make an overall introduction of the symposium. The International Symposium on What Do Museums Collect is aligned with What Do Museums Research. This is the second academic research project of MMCA. And basically, we focus on two issues. First is other ethnicities, other races in other domains. That is the concept of the otherness. And how is this relevant to the collection of museum? And second is the changes in the medias and forms of contemporary art and their following issues.
Hello. Well, first of all, words of thanks from me. First of all, thank you to Sun Hee Young for that very warm introduction, and also to you and your team, to the museum's director, Bartolomeo May, for inviting me to be here. I'm very pleased to be here and honoured to take part in the debates that we're going to have over the next couple of days. I'd love to be able to talk to you in ad lib, but I'm going to have to keep to my script, or the translators will tear me apart when it comes to the break. So let me start my presentation by saying that I want to be clear from the outset that my topic, the position that Indigenous art occupies within the contemporary Australian art field, sits a little uneasily with the concept of collecting others and cultural diversity, the concepts that frame this first day of this symposium. And this is so for two main reasons. The first concerns the role that Indigenous art now plays in the processes of reconciliation that have been underway in Australia since the 1990s. These processes have led to the introduction in Australia of a new vocabulary in which reconciliation is posed as a matter of acting on and changing the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, with the emphasis coming on Indigenous always being first. Far from belonging to the category of the other, Indigenous Australians, their art and their culture are in such formulations presented as being primary, in the sense of having been here in Australia first, but also primary as essential components of any understanding of what Australia is, should, and must be and become. The collection and exhibition of Indigenous art by Australian art institutions has accordingly parted ways with its earlier conception as the culture of a colonised other, as long-standing processes of the recollection, reclassification and reordering of Indigenous art have repositioned it as now central to the work of redefining the national culture, a process that makes ethical and political demands on all Australians. And these are processes in which Indigenous artists, curators and administrators, far from being the others that are collected, are the key people who have played major roles, key agenda-setting roles in these processes. So that's one reason why collecting the other and the vocabulary of cultural diversity doesn't work. The second has to do with the consideration that in Australia, the vocabulary of cultural diversity signals a quite different set of relations than those between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. It signals the relations between Australians of Anglo-Celtic descent, who have comprised the dominant ethnicity in Australia since Australia's colonisation in 1788. Relations between those then, on the one hand, on the other, Australians from a diversity of ethnic backgrounds, mainly later generations of migrants from southern Europe and eastern and southern Asia, who have migrated to Australia or whose parents did so. Cultural diversity issues in this sense have since the 1970s been addressed through governmental administrative portfolios and infrastructures, those of multiculturalism, that have been quite distinct, quite distinct, not entirely, from those administrative and policy apparatuses that have provided the interfaces between governments and Indigenous Australians. From the perspective of Indigenous Australians, the constituencies of multicultural Australia, today's Italian, Chinese, Indian, or Vietnamese Australians, are seen as non-Indigenous, and as such, just as much to be targeted alongside the Anglo-Celtic Australians in the endeavour to redefine Australian culture and selfhood around a greater recognition of the primacy and centrality of Indigenous culture. This differentiation of Indigenous from more general cultural diversity issues is reflected in Australia's art institutions by the separation of practices relating to the collection and exhibition of Indigenous art from those focused on Australia's various multicultural communities. It's not an entire separation, but the collection and exhibition of Indigenous art usually occupy different sections of Australia's main permanent galleries and are the subjects of separate special exhibitions from those focused on multicultural art. Indigenous Australians account for only 2.8% of the Australian population, while over 50% of Australians are either born overseas or have parents who were. Yet the gallery space that is currently accorded to Indigenous art in Australia far exceeds that accorded to the multicultural arts, and it is accorded a greater symbolic and political significance in public debates. So I want then, with that background in mind, to consider the place that Indigenous art occupies across a range of Australian gallery and museum practices as parts of programmes aimed at reforming the national culture, rather than as a form of collecting the other. To appreciate this properly will require going beyond the institutions of contemporary art, and indeed the art gallery sector more generally, to consider the part that the collection and exhibition of Indigenous art plays across a wider range of exhibition contexts, both within Australia and indeed internationally. And it is with the more general tendencies associated with the development of transnational art fields that I want to start. And I'm going to just now summarise the ground that I want to cover in the lecture. I'll look first at some of the key debates that are associated with the concept of the global contemporary, as a prelude to reviewing the main contexts for the exhibition of contemporary art in Australia. I then look at the history of collecting Indigenous art in Australia, especially its reclassification from being solely of ethnographic interest and to its aesthetic appreciation as art. I look next at different kinds of contemporary Indigenous art and the various ways in which they seek to reshape, through a series of political and cultural interventions, to reshape the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And I look finally at how different kinds of Indigenous art are viewed by Australians from different social backgrounds, and at how aesthetic forms of purification affect the reception of Indigenous artworks. I'll say, okay, to come to my first concern, debates regarding the global contemporary. I'm going to be relatively brief here, as I'm sure that the key points will be familiar to most of you. The displacement of the modernist paradigm by the more flattened out temporalities of contemporary art, for example, and the parallel shift from the dominance of easel painting effected by the development of installation and media art. These and other developments have resulted in a radically altered set of institutions for the exhibition of art. Terry Smith, my colleague and tomorrow's main speaker, keynote speaker, Terry Smith's concept of the extended art exhibitionary complex nicely captures the range of contemporary art values that go beyond the forms of the 19th century public museum. University and art school galleries, museums of modern and contemporary art, converted industrial spaces dedicated to large-scale commissioned installations, as well as the host of more improvised alternative and satellite spaces which, lacking permanent collections, provide the basis for more conjunctural interventions into the art field. The increasing influence of these new institutional actors has been closely tangled up with that of biennales and art fairs. From their origins in the 1890s, biennales have offered a counterpoint to the curatorial vision of national museums and galleries, albeit initially retaining the tradition of national pavilions associated with earlier international exhibitions of art and industry. The more decisive break, so experts say, came with the 1951 Sao Paulo Biennale, which both excluded national pavilions and initiated the move away from figurative traditions, articulating regionalist or nationalist values, toward abstraction as the key formal signature of a new set of transnational art world values, although it's important to say that this has been qualified many times since by new alignments between contemporary and figurative practices. The varied forms for art exhibition have taken up different positions in relationship to the next tendency that I want to discuss, the increasingly strong links between the institutions of the global contemporary and finance capital. There are a number of issues at stake here. The first centres on the weakening of art's autonomy from the economic field. Pierre Bourdieu's work has been a key point of reference here. His account of the anti-economic logic of the forms of art's autonomy produced by the struggle of late 19th and early 20th century modernist avant-gardes has informed recent assessments of the ways in which such markers of art's autonomy now serve only to enhance its economic value. The cultural economist Olav Velthius, for example, has shown how in commercial galleries, art auctions and art fairs, presentations of art as autonomous, in the sense of being disconnected from indicators of economic value, increase art's symbolic value and thereby its market value through its capacity to generate greater returns on financial investments in artworks. This also reflects the changed logic of global art markets owing to the operations of art investment funds in which art serves as an investment hedge for corporations and high-end wealth owners rather than as a symbolic asset for connoisseur collectors. A new logic of art markets in which prices are often governed less by the input of art historical forms of expertise than by market trends identified by algorithmic data programs. These various tendencies have contributed to a shift in the organization of practices of distinction, of social distinction, and the role that art plays in such practices. In his extremely influential work on French art audiences, Bourdieu stressed that what he called the love of art was most developed not among the dominant class, that is, those defined by their wealth and or controlling positions in the economy, but by those belonging to what he called the dominated fraction of the dominant class, that is, those occupying relatively privileged professional and management positions on the basis of their possession of cultural capital acquired through educational certification rather than on their inheritance of economic capital. While this is still a relevant consideration when it comes to the social characteristics of art gallery visitors, the social logics governing, or that now govern the relations between art markets and capital, have to be viewed alongside the marked increase in inequalities that has characterized contemporary Western societies since the 1980s. And these are exceedingly significant, massive increases in inequalities. We live in an increasingly unequal world, now only equalizing the inequalities experienced in Europe and elsewhere since the late 19th century. This has been accompanied by neoliberal attempts to weaken those forms of public funding which have sought to secure a degree of autonomy for the arts by reducing their reliance on markets while also protecting them from the threat of political direction from the state. I refer in the Australian context to institutions like the Australia Council, was established in the 1970s to administer public arts funding at an arm's length from the state, but which has over the last 4 to 5 years experienced attacks from the current government on both its funding and its autonomy. There are significant connections between these developments and the contemporary forms of art's globalization, a term I put in inverted commas because I think it's one that needs to be handled more cautiously than is usually the case. In art field debates, the concept of globalization invokes critiques of both the Eurocentrism of Western conceptions of art and of the temporalities informing Western art histories. While productive in both these respects, it's equally important to note the historical shrinkage of the publics that are involved in the key institutions of the contemporary forms of art's globalization. Caroline Jones's work on the relation between art and the world's fairs is instructive here. Between the 1851 Great Exhibition in London and the 1937 World's Fair in Paris, art was an integral component of World's Fairs, exhibited alongside exhibitions of industry, manufacturing, and technology. These connections between art and World's Fairs were, however, severed by the 1939 to 1945 war. Thereafter, the international exhibitions authorized by the Bureau International des Expositions no longer contain significant art exhibitions. At the same time, the new forms of international art exhibition inaugurated by the Sao Paulo Biennale eradicated national pavilions while also initiating a shift, as I said earlier, toward the would-be culturally universal artistic language of geometric abstraction. But what Jones fails to note, because it wasn't her main concern, is the considerable contraction in the publics that have been attracted to such international art contexts relative to the earlier World's Fairs. Attendance at the Sao Paulo Biennale was around 400,000, a figure which, although sometimes more than doubled in later biennales, is dwarfed by the 50 million people who visited Paris, Paris's 1901 exposition, Universal, an exhibition that was a key institutional site for the launching of Art Nouveau, and dwarfed by the 31 million who visited the 1937 Paris's World Fair, where Picasso's Guernica was exhibited in the Spanish pavilion. It's not just the lower numbers that matter here, it also matters that in accordance with their functioning as art markets, a good many of those who attend biennales and art fairs are people closely associated with art fields in one professional capacity or another. Artists, curators, dealers, critics, art theorists, and so on. This is not to suggest that all that happens at biennales is limited to their art market aspects. Just as artistic critiques were staged alongside world fairs, Manet's critique of national pavilions at the 1867 French Universal Exposition and surrealist critiques of the 1937 World's Fairs in Paris, for example, so biennales incorporate or are accompanied by various forms of socially productive art activism. The impact of such critiques is, however, another matter, in view of debates that have flourished in the wake of Luc Boltanski's and Yves Chiapello's account of the new spirit of capitalism and its capacity to incorporate critique as a source of value, an argument that was recently dramatized by the increase in both financial and historical art value of Banksy's Go with a Balloon following its staged shredding at Sotheby's London auction house. Okay, it's with these background considerations in mind then about some social aspects of the global contemporary that I now turn to look at some of the social, political and cultural tensions posed by the position that Indigenous art practices occupy within the Australian art field. But first, a little history to identify some key stages in the emergence of Australia's main institutions of contemporary art. Prior to the 1970s, the main institutional context for arts exhibition in Australia were provided by the various state galleries in Australia's main cities, such as the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and also by the regional galleries in smaller towns that had been, like these major state institutions, mainly established in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A leading role in expanding this range of context for arts exhibition was played by the Biennale of Sydney in 1974 and the Melbourne Art Fair that was initiated in 1988. But permanent institutions dedicated specifically to contemporary art date mostly from the mid-1990s. This is true of Sydney's Museum of Contemporary Art, Queensland's Gallery of Modern Art, the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, and in Melbourne, and in Hobart's privately funded Museum of Old and New Art. In the attention that these have accorded to new art practices, contemporary, abstract and video art in the main, but also installation and performance art, these have been amongst the most significant institutional drivers of change within the Australian art field. This is also true of the Asia-Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art, which has contributed significantly to the contemporary repositioning of Australian art within the Asia-Pacific region. Subsequent developments have included the opening of carriage works in a disused railway yard in 2007 and the establishment of the Sydney Contemporary Art Fair. There are other examples too. I'm just trying to give you a flavour here. I'm mainly focused on the city closest to which I live, Sydney. These have all been significant venues for the exhibition of contemporary Indigenous art. But the same is true of a much wider range of institutions. The exhibition of contemporary art is not limited to, or even particularly privileged to, institutions of contemporary art. A good deal of Indigenous contemporary art is exhibited in history museums, like the National Museum of Australia, which frequently exhibits contemporary Indigenous art, as in its recent hosting of an exhibition called Black Mist Burnt Country, a travelling exhibition featuring works like Geoffrey Quima's Destruction 2, depicting the destruction of the relations between the Pitjantjatjara people and their land that was wrought by post-war British atomic testing in the Maralinga area in South Australia. The National Gallery of Australia, established in 1982, has also played a leading role in its development of a significant permanent collection of Indigenous art, and it also now hosts the National Indigenous Arts Triennial. The 2017 theme for this triennial, Defying Empire, and I'll let you read this, nicely illustrates the varied forms of intervention that Indigenous artists seek to make into Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. However, we need to take a longer look at the histories of the reclassification and reordering of Indigenous art that have helped to shape and been shaped by such interventions. For the greater part of the 19th, the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, Indigenous art practices were excluded from the category of art, consigned instead to natural history museums as illustrations of primitive cultures organised under the curatorial direction of anthropologists rather than that of art historians. There are some exceptions to that, but that's the broad picture. The first exhibition, exhibition in an art institution of Aboriginal art, was held at the National Museum of Victoria in 1929, but still as an illustration of, in quotes, primitive art. It was not until the 1940s that fine art categories began to be applied to Aboriginal art, or that Australia's main art galleries began to collect the work of practicing contemporary Aboriginal artists, a trend that was initiated by the Art Gallery of South Australia's acquisition in 1939 of a watercolour landscape by Albert Namatjira, the leading representative of the Hermannsburg school, defined by its synthesis, albeit variably interpreted, its synthesis of Indigenous and white art practices. The intervening period, and I'm going to skip over a lot of developments here, most notably since the 1970s, has witnessed what I'll call a complex dance of agency between a wide range of actors, Indigenous artists and art collectives, Indigenous communities more broadly speaking, arts policy agencies, art critics, art gallery and festival directors and curators. These have all interacted in various complicated ways to bring about an increasingly wide range of Indigenous art being interpreted, valorised and exhibited as art before both Australian and international art publics. This has, in some contexts, undoubtedly been accompanied by aestheticized interpretations of Indigenous art as the work of an exoticized other. This has happened within Australia, it's happened perhaps more significantly outside it. A more interesting development, typically the fruit of collaborative relations between Indigenous artists, anthropologists, and art historians, has consisted in the significant revisions of traditional art history conceptions of individualized forms of creativity to accommodate the collective forms of creative agency associated with many forms of Indigenous art. But what I want to focus on today are some of the strategies deployed by Indigenous artists, curators and activists to develop Indigenous art practices in pursuit of a variety of cultural, political and cultural ends. This has been particularly true since the reconciliation policies introduced in the 1990s, in view of how these have opened up an officially sanctioned zone of dialogue focused on the role that Indigenous art might play in relation to the Indigenous, non-Indigenous binary that I referred to in my introductory remarks. And I can best get into these issues by showing some examples of contemporary Indigenous art and commenting on how they seek to reshape Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations via the positions they take up in relation to either earlier Indigenous practices, contemporary Western art practices, and dominant Australian histories. So the examples I'm showing by no means cover the full range of different kinds of contemporary Indigenous art. They just illustrate a few of them. My first example is by the artist Rover Thomas from his Massacre series. Rover Thomas, an internationally acclaimed artist from the Kimberley region in West Australia, whose work was exhibited at the 1990 Venice Biennale. While drawing on Indigenous motifs in ways that align these with the international language of visual abstraction, Rover Thomas recognized similarities between his work and that of Mark Rothko, for example. The difference consisted in his adaptation of these to the explicit purpose of telling a story. And the story that is told here, though I can't unpack it for you, is that of a series of frontier killings of Aborigines in what is now referred to as the killing times of the Kimberley region, one aspect of the frontier wars that are increasingly prominent in recent revisions, recognition of which is increasingly prominent in recent revisions of Australian history. My next example from the author, not from the author, from the artist, Brooke Andrews, is an instance of what has been called by Nicholas Thomas reverse fieldwork. That is, practice in which Indigenous artists immerse themselves in the archives of Western museum collections containing Indigenous materials that have been collected, plundered, stolen, which, however you want to look at it, in earlier colonial histories. Practices which then rework those archival materials in the light of their own critical art practice. So in the case of Brooke Andrews, this is Menthuan Q here, stages 100 Aboriginal art shields that have been held by the Australian Museum in Sydney. These have been gathered initially as parts of that museum's natural history collections. And it's an installation which allows and invites the visitor to take up the position of either the Aboriginal defending his country against the invader, or that of an invader facing an Aboriginal battle formation. I'm going to come on in a moment to the artist Julie Goff's work, which exemplifies a different critical orientation, one that pitches itself against earlier pastoral idealizations of the Australian landscape, which, in being depicted as empty, presented the land as ripe for colonial exploitation. Although sometimes including Aborigines in his landscape, John Glover, perhaps the most famous colonial landscape portraitist of the 19th century, often did not, as in his Patterdale landscape with cattle, which is an example of the conventions of pastoral art that Julie Goff takes issue with by overpainting them with the marks of colonial killings. Tony Albert's hopeless romanticism represents a different critical strategy in its critical commentary on the stereotypical depictions of Aborigines that were widely circulated in tourist memorabilia. This is the installation currently in the National Art Gallery. In which, to show you the detail, it is a critical deconstruction of these depictions of Aborigines that were circulated in tourist forms of kitsch art. And finally, there's an extensive body of work, represented by Reg Mombassa amongst others, belonging to the genre of what has been called uncooking history. That is to say, disputing those foundational narratives of Australian colonialism in which Captain Cook is depicted as the founder of the national narrative. Indicated here in this Reg Mombassa Jim Cook mugshot, in which Jim Cook was said to be executed for the armed robbery by the people of the South Pacific in 1779. Okay, I won't go into the details of that. Because the strategy I want to look at in a little bit more detail is the pedagogic orientation that stresses the need for non-Indigenous Australians now to understand the diversity of Australian cultures and their relationships to country. By country is the way in which Indigenous Australians now refer to the territorially differentiated language, cultural and political units that pre-existed colonisation and that have subsisted, continue to exist into the present. That said, these territorially defined units, these different countries, were considerably weakened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by the combined effects of colonial massacres and the policy of uprooting Indigenous people from their countries to place them in government-administered reserves. They have, however, since been revived and accorded a major symbolic significance in contemporary demands for recognition of and respect for the resilience and variety of Indigenous cultures, these different Indigenous cultures, and in claims for the restitution of the lands that were taken away from them. This map of Indigenous Australia that I'm showing here, produced by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, has been of major significance in this regard. Each different colour that you see on this map represents a different unit of language and culture. Okay? It's been of major significance in this regard in offering a comprehensive mapping of culture to country. It is a map which accompanies the exhibition of Indigenous culture at many Australian museums, sometimes in highly stylised but widely recognisable forms, as in this current use of the map at the National Museum of Australia. The rendering of this map by Indigenous artist Josephine Mick in her Seven Sisters songline, which is what this is called, was also used at the National Museum of Australia to introduce its 2017 exhibition of regional variations country by country, of the Seven Sisters Star Dreaming story, which is a story that forms an influential aspect of Australian Indigenous cosmologies. And finally, I want to show Jidda Gulpilil's Back in Country. This was a part of an exhibition called Encounters that was held at the National Museum of Australia in 2015 to 16. The guiding theme of this exhibition was that of objects from the British Museum's collection of Indigenous materials that had been taken to the British Museum really from the moment that Captain Cook's first voyage in the 1770s right the way through to anthropological exhibitions in the early 20th century. These materials were returned on loan to the National Museum of Australia to stage an exhibition. And the rhetoric of this exhibition was how, on being returned to Australia, these objects would re-receive, would regain their true meaning by being exhibited in the context of the cultures, the particular regionalised, territorialised cultures in Australia that they've been taken away from. A message that Jidda Gulpilil makes clear in the text that accompanies his painting. Doing this bark is not about making an etching and having something physical to show. It's a lot more than that. It's to send a message, to show people who we are, how we're connected to country, our spiritual and physical connection. There is then a significant diversity in the practices that fall under the heading of Indigenous art. A diversity that is best understood in terms of its positioning as a relatively autonomous art field that operates athwart, that straddles the relations between the Australian art field and international art fields. My concern in what I've been presenting so far has been mainly with its distinctive position within the Australian art field. It's distinctive, I've argued, in its differentiation from the forms of cultural diversity associated with multicultural art policies and practices, distinctive in the connections that it establishes with collective forms and traditions of arts production, which eschew the claims to individualistic forms of artistic creation characteristic of Western art traditions, and distinctive in its contemporary repositioning from its early 20th century ethnographic framings as worthy of only preservation of mementos of a dying culture, to its claims to provide a basis for a redefinition of Australian culture for all Australians that acknowledges the historical primacy, resilience, and dynamism of Indigenous culture. There's another aspect to the diversity of Indigenous art that I want to comment on briefly before resuming my main thread. I included in my slides pictures of the artists whose work I have presented as a way of avoiding stereotypical conceptions of Indigenous Australians, who, as you will have noticed from the pictures that I put up, are highly variable in their skin colour, reflecting mixed ancestries as they are in many other respects. These differences have sometimes occasioned debate amongst Indigenous artists, some of whom, notably those with mixed ancestries living in urban areas, have resisted describing their work as Indigenous art in view of the essentialising and racialised conceptions of Aboriginality that this often implies. That's much less true now, but there was a time when it was. My purpose in drawing attention to these considerations is to emphasise that in Australia, indigeneity is not a matter of skin colour. It is not a matter of skin colour, but a combination of three things: identification of the person concerned as Indigenous, a bloodline that includes Indigenous ancestry, but not exclusively so, and recognition of claims to Indigenous identity by a specific Indigenous community. But to come back now to my main concerns, I want to look at the social patterns of participation in Australian art institutions, particularly those associated with contemporary art, and their implications for how different kinds of Indigenous art are engaged with by different sections of the Australian population. And I'll also look at how the ways in which some Australians relate to Indigenous art differs from their interpretations of other kinds of contemporary art in ways that reflect the position that Indigenous art now occupies as an ethical, political mediator of the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. First then, and I apologise for doing this in an art museum, but some statistics. The statistics I'm showing are from a 2015 national survey of the cultural tastes and practices of 1,200 Australians that I directed as a part of a project called the Australian Cultural Fields Project, funded by the Australian Research Council. So a few points I want to note. The first point is to note how many Australians never visit art galleries of any kind. 35% of this sample, compare, for example, to 15% who never go to heritage or history museums. A significant variation. Never visiting art galleries is also most strongly associated with, with class position. Close to 50% of those in the working class never visit art galleries, roughly twice the size for those in professional and managerial positions. The same is true for level of education. 50% of those with some secondary education and 30% of those with completed secondary education, as opposed to people who've gone on to universities, have never visited an art gallery, compared with only 7% of the tertiary educated and 0% of those with postgraduate degrees who've never been to an art gallery. And these discrepancies tend to be more pronounced for museums of contemporary art, biennales and art fairs than for other kinds of art galleries. Oops. Yeah. Participation in these for the working and intermediate classes is lower than for their levels of participation in longer established state and regional galleries, and at only about half the rate of the levels of participation exhibited by members of the professional and managerial classes. The differences associated with level of education are even more pronounced, which is where I am now. At between 5 and 10%, in contrast to the rates of 50% plus of those with postgraduate degrees. It's also important to note that across all classes, younger people, those in their 20s, 30s and early 40s, are much more likely to visit contemporary art institutions than their older counterparts. There are, of course, differences and complications. This is a quick flick of a picture, but these statistics testify to the continuing relevance of Pierre Bourdieu's arguments concerning the unequal distribution of an interest in and taste for and capacity to engage with art institutions, particularly those associated with contemporary art. A reminder again of the greater social reach of the exhibition of art associated with the 19th and early 20th century exhibitionary complex than that achieved by the institutions of the global contemporary. The survey also asked respondents about their favourite genres. Aboriginal art was, after landscapes, the second most popular genre, a testimony to its role as a key symbolic, ethical and political mediator of the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. There was, moreover, relatively little differentiation in this preference in terms of class position, gender, age or level of education. But this was less true when it came to particular kinds of Indigenous artists. While 53% of higher level professionals, had seen and liked the work of Almat Namatjira, this was only true of 37% of routine workers. Tracy Moffat, a prominent feminist Indigenous media artist whose work was exhibited at the 2017 Venice Biennale, is similarly more widely recognized and liked among the tertiary educated members of the sample, especially those in the younger age groups. But let me put responses to particular artists to one side now to look at how engagements with Indigenous art are differently reflected according to the discursive frameworks within which they are interpreted. In doing so, I'm drawing on the terms proposed by Laura Fisher in her study Aboriginal Art and Australian Society, in the contrast that she proposes between Indigenous conceptions of art for what she calls art for culture's sake, that is, the use of Indigenous art within Indigenous communities as a means for the rediscovery, remaking and cross-generational transmission of the relations between culture and country, but also art for culture's sake means using art as a pedagogic, civic bridgehead into white Australia. The contrast then between these conceptions of art for culture's sake and white interpretations of Aboriginal art within the aesthetic register of art for art's sake. She's particularly concerned with the consequences that follow from the kinds of aesthetic purification associated with those forms of white engagement with Aboriginal art that are informed by such aesthetic conceptions in view of how these often distance such engagements with Indigenous art from the less palatable aspects of Indigenous presence in contemporary Australia. Indigenous claims to sovereignty over land versus the interests of the mining sector, levels of trauma and disadvantage on the part of Indigenous Australians that are unimaginable from the point of view of urban middle-class life, uncomfortable reminders of the violence of Australia's frontier history, and also uncomfortable reminders of the commercial logic that underpins stereotype depictions of Aborigines in tourist kitsch. So let me look first at how the art for culture's sake discourse frames the responses of some members of the Australian Cultural Field Survey when in follow-up interviews they were asked to elaborate on their tastes in more detail. You can see something of what I want to get at here in responses to the work of Albert Namatjira, the first Indigenous artist to be accorded significant recognition by white Australian art institutions. Namatjira's work was initially interpreted as an imitative adaptation of the traditions of pastoral modernism that had characterized interwar landscape painting. His typical landscape scenes, ghost gums, palm-filled gorges, distant mountains in the purple light of dusk, all devoid of any human presence, were also viewed as prophesying a future from which Aborigines had been evacuated. Such are similarist interpretations of the 1950s and 1960s, when Namatjira was more or less an icon of suburban Australia, have given way to appreciations now of Namatjira's work for the ways in which it mediates the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous values of country. Far from being empty, his landscapes are now said to be imbued with the presence of ancestors whose final resting place give order and shape to nature, thus building what has been called by one critic a new compact between Indigenous and Western world views. And it's this conception that frames the views of the survey respondents we interviewed. For one, Namatjira serves as a counter to his dislike of modern and abstract art because his paintings are, he says, I'll come to that, his paintings are real. They just feel like he's telling a story in his picture, and they're real. A second interviewee similarly distinguishes Namatjira's work from the abstract style of dot painting, valuing it for how it mediates the relations between Aboriginal and mainstream Australian art. He was an Aboriginal guy, but he didn't paint in the dot style or whatever you want to call it. I mean, he painted in the white man style, but he obviously had talent, and being an Aussie, I guess he saw things from his perspective, with the Indigenous perspective, and I like that about his work. Other responses echo this concern to disconnect Indigenous art from its association in many of its forms with abstraction, one of the least popular genres in our survey, to stress its value as an exceptional form of abstraction with a readily intelligible referent in view of what it has to say about the surveys, the connections between culture and country. While attracted to the uniqueness of Aboriginal art and dots, one interviewee distinguishes this from his negative views of modern and abstract art, equivalent, he says, to what my daughters would do in kindergarten. And he distinguishes it from other forms of abstract art. Why? Because there's stories behind it. That art over there is a story they're trying to tell. Another interviewee who also dislikes abstract art. When I'm thinking of abstract, I'm thinking of splotches of colour and just plain blocks, but likes the dynamic colour of Aboriginal art, the movement in it, the stories behind it, the connections that it has. And Tracy Moffat's work is singled out for special mention. I love Tracy's storytelling. Yeah, I like the fact that when she interviews, she always talks about representation, not just for women, but for Aboriginal women. Yeah. We can see in these comments how the art for culture's sake discourse lends a degree of ethical earnestness to how some non-Indigenous Australians respond to Indigenous art. But I want to conclude by illustrating Laura Fisher's concerns regarding the forms of purification that can accompany the collection, exhibition and public engagement with Indigenous art. And I'm going to do so in relationship to the Aboriginal Memorial. Exhibited initially at the 1988 Sydney Biennale, this was included in the National Gallery of Australia's first major exhibition of Aboriginal art in 1989, and it was placed in 1991 at the gallery's entrance, where it remains. The work of 43 Raminjining artists, organised by Indigenous curator John Mundine, the memorial comprises 200 log coffins. Each of these is a log coffin, in memoriam for each year of Indigenous deaths inflicted between Australia's colonisation in 1788 and, when this work was made and shown, Australia's bicentennial celebrations of 1988. In reviewing the history of commentary that has guided subsequent interpretations of this installation, the Indigenous art critic Nigel Lendon argues that it has placed the memorial within a range of conflicting aesthetic registers, interpreted variously as a canonical work of Australian art, as a modernist masterpiece, as an instance of contemporary art expressing an anti-modernist temporality. But in reviewing these interpretations, Lendon seeks to peel them away in order to restore to the memorial horizons of significance that stand outside them. In his interpretation, it's continuation of long-standing forms of Indigenous cultural production as a means of intercultural socio-political agency. Its significance for Indigenous Australians as a memorial to the unacknowledged war dead of the frontier years. Important because the Australian War Memorial, the official memorial institution in Australia, refuses to acknowledge frontier killings as among Australia's war deads. And its repudiation of individualist forms of aesthetic innovation in favour of the collective artistic traditions on which the memorial draws. But there's another conflicting aspect to this story, one that was highlighted by the recent addition of the names of the individual artists responsible for each of the log coffins to the information accompanying this exhibition at the National Gallery of Australia. This was something which, in a recent interview, the exhibition's original curator, John Mundine, tells us he had campaigned for and welcomed for according Indigenous artists the same individualised forms of recognition that other artists receive. So it's contradictory. Admired in some cases for being collective, and in other cases wishing to restore to it individualised forms of aesthetic recognition. This is then a complex, exceedingly complex art installation, evoking a plenitude of different responses from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and as such, lending eloquent testimony to the complex ways in which the discourses of art for culture's sake and art for art's sake operate in mediating the collection, production and reception of Indigenous art in the contemporary Australian art field. To sum up then, I've tried to show how the processes of what I've called recollecting, reclassifying and reordering Indigenous art in Australia are best understood as now comprising parts of programs which, far from being a form of collecting the other, aims to produce a new sense of national selfhood that will define the future unfolding of the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. I believe this is important work that has already seriously challenged earlier white settler conceptions of Australianness and brought about key changes in the contemporary symbolics of nationhood. But it also, as I've tried to show, has its contradictions, and it also has its limitations. The persistence of abject conditions of life for so many Indigenous Australians who have much lower rates of life expectancy, much higher rates of imprisonment, and much lower rates of literacy and education and employment than other Australians, and the continuing failure to meet the claims of Indigenous Australians for distinctive constitutional and political recognition, testify to the fact that there's still a long way to go before the symbolic gains registered by Indigenous art are accompanied by adequate material and political improvements for Indigenous Australians as a whole. Thank you.